I think Clip Studio Paint is great for animation, especially if you want to mimic that 2D animation hand-drawn look like you see in anime. Here we're going to be animating obviously in my way. I'm curious to know how you guys animate, so leave your approaches in the comments below. I'm very curious to hear what you guys do. And as someone who used the internet to learn 80-90% of everything I know, at least when it comes to making comics and animation, I know what you're looking for. Think of this video as the ultimate guide for those who want to learn how to animate in Clip Studio Paint. The first half of this video is going to focus on the basics, all the need to knows, especially if you're a beginner, so that when we start going into the intermediate stuff, you understand what I'm saying. So first the basics / foundation, and then the second half is to take those foundations and have an anime style application. Again, we at Saturday AM, publishers of the world's most diverse manga anthologies, partnered up with Celsius, the creators of Clip Studio Paint, to bring these videos to you. These videos are part of a playlist teaching you guys how to use Clip Studio Paint, as well as a documentary where we use Clip Studio Paint to create a complete full comic called Saturday Wars. That's a collection of all Saturday AM core lead characters coming together in a crossover event to battle one common enemy. And Saturday Wars is going to be published inside our newest physical magazine called Super Saturday, coming this December. You can pre-order, link in the description as well. Think of it like Avengers Infinity War, but with Saturday AM characters like Sano from my series Apple Black. So if you want to give Clip Studio Paint a try, use the link in my description to get a 3-month free trial. Now first, the basics. Leg out. I'm just going to create the animation file in the workspace. You go up here to File, New. So just go up here to Use of Work and here to Animation. You click that and it gives you these options. You don't really want to change much of these, but the standard here will have width at 920, height at 1080, and resolution at least 300. You don't want to play with these too much. You can change the names of things if you want, like say the story name. You can rename the timeline if you want, but you can just leave it as timeline 1 for now. Frame rate at 12. So this is 12 frames per second. And that's kind of how things will be timed in the animation. There are some that work 23, 24, even 30, but we're just going to work in 12 for this tutorial. And then the playback time, this is essentially how many frames we're kind of going to see in the timeline at the bottom. And we can just have this be 60 for now. So 60 frames, that's basically 5 seconds. Over here at the bottom of blank space, we just have 20 pixels on each end, and that's it right here. The main animation will be within the output frame. That's everything inside this blue line. But you can export outside the blue line and within, but that will be when we start talking about the options that you have when you want to export your animation. After you're done with everything here, you just hit OK. And voila. Obviously, you can zoom in and out. You have the animation folder, which is different from a regular folder. I'll explain in a second. And then you have a layer within that animation folder already. And then you have the paper layer right here. But we kind of want to see our timeline, and that's where you kind of go to the window and you go hit timeline. And then you get that option. Now, I'm just going to turn it back off for a second just so I can pull the canvas up, because I want to be able to see the horizontal scroll bar. And then I turn the timeline back on. And in the timeline, you can also see the same animation folder, same as this one right here, and then the paper folder. Once you create this animation workspace and this animation file from the jump, you automatically get an animation folder and this paper folder. And inside that animation folder, you automatically get what is called a cell. And you can see the cell is numbered 1 and it has the same name with the layer in the animation folder in the layer window. This is the layer window. This is the timeline window. But you can change how the timeline looks by coming here to see if you want to show thumbnails and all, but I don't need that, so I'm just gonna turn that back to none. But you have more options there. The paper layer here is linked to the paper row here in the timeline window. Again, if I make it invisible here, it's invisible there. I haven't drawn anything inside the layer, inside the animation folder, so we don't see anything visually. So even if I turn it off, it's not really doing anything. But the paper layer, that's what's behind everything at the bottom. The timeline window is where we're going to be playing with the keyframes, the frames, and all that good stuff. All will be explained. This is where the magic happens. You have an option here to create another animation folder if you want. And for now, you guys might not understand why, but just stay with me here. If we hit that, it'll create another animation folder. Obviously, you can rename it. Let's call it Animate 2. And then it has no cells in it. And as a result, you see it has no layers inside this animation folder. To create a cell, hit this button for new animation cell, and it will create another one called 1, and it automatically created another layer here with the same name again. This is frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 60 frames for 5 seconds. Placed at 12 frames per second as we planned, but this is one cell. So essentially all 60 frames are in this one cell. This one cell is linked to the layer in the animation folder in the layer window of the same name. So therefore, all the frames in this cell will display what's in the layer that it's linked to. Here you can see it has the same animation folder name. So it can only be linked to a layer within that same animation folder. Same goes for the other animation folder. This layer right here, we click on it, you can see it's highlighted with this red bar. It can only be linked to any layer within this same animation folder. You can create another cell, create new animation cell, that's 2, and it automatically created a new layer with the same name. Now, all these frames are in cell 1, and therefore they will display everything that's linked to the layer for cell 1, and that's this layer 1. But for layer 2, which is literally everything else, whatever is in layer 2 will be displayed for all these frames within this cell. We can just delete this animation folder for a second. We don't need both. Let's come over here to layer window, right click, and I hit delete, and it's gone. Because we deleted the animation folder in the layer window, the animation folder in the timeline window is also gone. Come back up here. If we create another cell, all the frames in cell 3 will display whatever layer 3 is, because that's the layer that the cell is linked to. You can move the cells and readjust the timing of things. And just to test things out, we have layer 1, and then for layer 2, and then 3. If you then drag the cursor back to the beginning, or you have this icon here to go to the start, and it'll just automatically go to the first frame, and then hit the play button, and there you have your change. Create another cell, 4. It's named in a sequence, and it automatically creates the layer in the layer window, and depending on what layer you want, it'll just jump to the first frame within that cell. And again, we can move that cell. And now go to the start, and then hit play. That's essentially how it works. Once the cursor gets to the end of the timeline, because the playback is at 60, it's ending here, it then reverts back. Almost like a loop, almost like a little GIF. And we can move this around if we wanted to end a little earlier. So you can readjust the playback afterwards. And so you hit play. And there you go. Kind of in a loop. Press pause. Gonna take it back to 60. Another way to change that would be to go to animation here at the top, then timeline, and then change settings, and we can change it from 60 to, let's say, 45. Hit OK and see what happens. It reduces to 45. Control Z, back to 60. We can also change the frame rate as well if we go to animation and then go to timeline and then change frame rate. Change it from 12 to whatever else we want. Here's a 12. Let's say we wanted to change that to 24. It automatically changed the numbers, as you can see at the top. So now it's 24 frames per second, meaning that now 60, it's no longer 5 seconds. It's really like maybe 2.5 seconds. Control Z, and gives us back what we initially had, and now it's back to 5 seconds. Once you're on the layer, it will automatically move to the linked cell on the timeline, as you can see. And then don't forget that the cells created on the timeline of an animation folder row can only be linked to a layer in the animation folder of the same name in the layer window. Creating cells automatically create a new layer in the layer window, and then it has a naming sequence for organizational purposes. Here it's kind of naming things 1, 2, 3, 4. It gets a little complicated later on, but for now, that's the basic gist. So now I'm going to create a new animation folder, Animate 3, and I'm going to turn off the previous animation folder we're working on. And let's do something new. Again, it has no cells in it, so we'll create a new animation cell. We're going to change the color. So in this new layer here, let's draw something simple. maybe a silhouette of a bird. And now all the frames in cell 1 are going to show this bird. Say frame 6, I create a new cell. So it's the 6th frame, but I want to create the 2nd keyframe to cell 2. What's a keyframe? A keyframe in animation and filmmaking is a drawing or a shot that defines the starting and end points of any smooth transition. These are called frames because their position and time is measured in frames on the strip of film or on the digital video editing timeline, like the timeline we have in Clip Studio Paint. In-betweens are just the frames in between the keyframe. Always do keyframes before you do the in-betweens because the keyframes are that. They're the key frames. They're the major positions to watch out for, and then the in-betweens just connect the dots. That's standard practice. You don't draw each image frame by frame. You draw all the keyframes first, space them out, and then draw the in-betweens. And that comes with practice and knowledge of the guides of animation, like the 12 principles of animation, and so on and so forth. So now I want to draw the 2nd image in layer 2 for cell 2 for our 2nd keyframe. But I kind of need to know where the 1st image ended in order to draw the next one. Let's just draw, so 2nd image, bird flapping his wings a little bit. Use this key here to go to the previous frame and see what that was. Or you can just click directly on the cell itself, and it'll just kind of show you the 2 keyframes. Now that you can see that the positioning is off a little bit, because it's almost like the bird is flying backwards. So one way to do that would be on that same layer, let's say Control T to kind of move it forward a bit. But even then, yeah, we kind of nailed it now, but an easier way, so I'll Control Z right there, would be to turn on what's called the onion skin. So enable onion skin with this icon, and that way you can see the previous frame. If we had a new cell, let's say a cell 3 in front, enabling the onion skin will allow us to see what's in front and what's behind. We only have a cell behind, so we're only seeing what's behind. And if we go to the 1st cell, we're kind of seeing what's in front. So now with the onion skin enabled, I know exactly where that frame should be. I can even see it better. So even rather than drawing it without seeing, using the image already made, I can almost trace it to a degree, even better than I did before, and then flap the wings. Maybe move a little forward, even more, and there you go. We can also disable onion skin for a second, just to see it without it, and these are the 2 keyframes. Now let's create a 3rd keyframe, go to 2, and let's hit new animation cell. Notice what it did. When creating the 3rd cell, it actually copies the properties of the 2nd cell, including the distance the 2nd cell has with the previous cell before that, which would be the 1st one. But cell 3 only copies that distance when you create a new cell while highlighting the 1st frame of cell 2. After cell 2, then it would have just created a new cell in that spot, but it would have still copied the other properties, like the fact that it's just a layer. It would have copied the opacity, which is 100, and the blending mode, which is normal. I'll explain further as we go on. If I move this cell 3 around, so you can move the cells around to readjust the animation. If everything kind of seems a little off, you can readjust. But just moving that, if we're on 3 and we created a new cell, you can see it mimic the distance from 3 to 2. Let's pull that 4. 4, create a new cell, the distance from 3 to 4. So Control Z, Z, go by 3. Kind of want it here. I'm going to turn back on the onion skin, and now I'm going to draw the 3rd image in layer 3 for cell 3. If I turn off the onion skin, there you go. Now if we're on cell 2, we can kind of see what's in front and what's behind. What I have behind is in red, and what I have in front is in green. I purposely have the colors being a little desaturated so I get to see the black lines very clearly. Say the same black lines we use for the line art of our animations. If you want to play around with the settings of the onion skin, just go here at the top to animation, show animation cells, and then onion skin settings, and then you can change the colors over here for previous frame and the next frame, and then how many frames you want to see ahead. So sometimes you'll be able to see more than 1 frame behind and more than 1 frame ahead. You can play around with those settings, and the further away, the more faded it's going to be. But sometimes that can look really complicated, so you can just leave it at 1 And I like these colors because red just kind of tells me, okay, it's back, and green, I know it's ahead. And I hit okay. I'm just gonna close that animation folder right here. So these are our keyframes, and now we want to make the in-betweens. Here we're trying to get a smooth transition from the first image in cell 1 to the next image in cell 2, and so on. You can highlight the cells and move them around if you want to take 1 second. So it's basically 1 second to flap his wings. At least in this animation, we can readjust it later. But then I want to figure out the perfect places to insert new cells that will be our in-betweens for the animation to be smooth. Before we go any further, you can see that the drawing looks kind of pixelated, and that's because over here, if you go to animation, and then you have the playback settings, I have it on play in real time, loop play, and prefer speed. And this just makes it that while we're working, the software is moving and working fast, and the whole workflow is not interrupted. Because if we go to prefer quality, then everything's gonna look better, but it might slow down your process because, you know, the computer or the software will kind of slow down a little bit. With these settings, it just allows us to make sure our animation is on point, hence prefer speed. And then when we export the image, it can actually be the more accurate quality. So notice the naming patterns. If we then go in between cells to create a new cell, what happens is it does 1A. And with the onion skin enabled, we can kind of see the images before and after, so we know where to draw the image in the middle. This tutorial will focus more on the application with Clip Studio Paint and less so where to put your keyframes, because that kind of comes with practice and time. And I recommend you do a lot of research with animation guides that are out there and the 12 principles of animation, because at this point that's more about how to animate in general, whether it's with Clip Studio Paint or traditionally or literally anything else. It's a whole new world where you're trying to figure out where and when and how to time your frames and in-betweens and keyframes and all that. So here I have that, and maybe I want another one. That would be 1B. And there you go. Another cell in between 2 and 3. And at the end, I'm going to create a new cell. But here's the thing. I want to create a little loop, right? So if I create a new cell, it's going to create a new layer 4. If you delete a cell over here, it doesn't get rid of layer 4. Layer 4 still exists, even though we've not drawn anything in it. The layer has been created. But, Control C, if it's still connected, if we delete layer 4, then that makes cell 4 empty because it's not linked to any layer within the animation folder. So doing stuff like this can be a mess, but we can still take the cell and then go using this button, specify cells, while on that animation folder row, it'll then give us the options of layers within that animation folder to link to that already exist. And I want to link it to layer 1, meaning you can actually link multiple cells to the same layer. So notice the naming sequence, anything in between, we'll just kind of add alphabets. And if we were in between alphabets, then it just kind of has this weird default where it just says layer 1, right? It then starts layer 1 all over again. We're just going to Control Z because we don't need that. We don't have anything for that frame anyways. We don't want to draw anything there. But here, because it's after 3, if we create something new, it'll just be 4 still, 4. But note that if we then delete this cell, remember, deleting the cell doesn't delete the layer that's already been created for it in the animation folder. But if we then want it that comes after 3, in between 3 and 1, it's not going to do 4 this time. It's going to do 3A. Because when creating a new cell, it doesn't give it a name of a layer that already exists. So because 4 already exists over here, and so it's just going to do a 3A. Remember guys, if you highlight the first frame within the cell and then you create new animation cell with that icon, it's going to mimic the distance between that cell you started from and the cell before that. So you see 2 frames here, and then you see 2 frames here, and then you have it created, right? So it's copying that distance. However, you can highlight wherever you want in the frame, right? As long as it's not the first frame, and then turn that on, and then create a new animation cell, whatever frame you want or whatever frame you have highlighted within that cell. It's just going to create the new cell there. Obviously not copying the distances anymore. If you want to copy the distance, you have to be on the first frame. So if we create our cell here, let's say like so, we have it 3A. So even though it's not copying the distances, it's still copying some of the properties from cell 3. And that's the properties from the layer that it creates. So here you can see 3A is 100% opacity with a blending mode of normal. That's because it copied it from its previous cell that's linked to a layer with those same properties, 100% opacity and blending mode normal. So let's test that. If we go to 3, and reduce the opacity to 59 and the blending mode of multiply. Now, if we create a new cell, whether we're on the first layer, we'll mimic the same distances from the previous cell here, in this case 2A, 2 frames, 2 frames, but you can see it does the 59% opacity and a multiply blending mode. Or you just create your cell and you don't want to copy that distance, so you create the new cell wherever you want, let's say here. And remember, you can always move it around later, so it doesn't really matter. Have it at 3A. Again, it copies the properties of the previous cell, right, based off of the properties on the layer that that cell is linked to. Move that around. Have the onion skin on so I can see 3 and 1. I don't want that. I kind of want the blending mode to be normal anyways. I was just doing that to explain something. And create another in between with another cell. And then 1, if we hit play, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Because all these frames are now linked to the image in layer 1. And so all these frames are going to show that. So what you can do is then click and drag all of these, hold Alt, and then drag it forward, and then you have it again. Now you have new cells all linking to those same layers. So you don't have to keep creating new cells. We just have enough to kind of get our loop going. And then I can select the whole thing, hold Alt, and then drag again for more. I can increase the playback, increase the bar for that cell if it ends there at 71. Because if you don't have that, once it gets to that part in the timeline, it's literally not going to show anything, right? Because even for the paper, it ends there. So I can extend the paper as well to be there. And we want this to extend to the end as well. Just for kicks, we'll extend that layer as well, but it's turned off, so it doesn't really matter. I get these bad boys back. Or you can just come here to where it needs to be and go to specify cell and then pick the appropriate cell. So after 2A is 3, and then you hit OK, and it'll just link to that. Now if we hit play, and this is almost like a little GIF, and it's flapping it for what, 6 seconds? Because it's a loop, we don't need to like copy it all the time, so we can actually reduce this to here. As long as the cell pattern is repeated, and we start with a cell 1 and then end with the cell right before cell 1. In this case, 3B. Because on the timeline as the cursor is moving, once it gets to the end, it just goes back to the first. Then you can hit pause. What these icons do, this takes us to the last frame, and this takes us to the first. This takes us to the next frame, and this takes us to the previous frame, and this is for play. And this is where we can test it out to see if we want to move things around to get maybe a better, smoother animation. Sometimes, if these frames are not maybe in-betweens, they're actually just all keyframes, or you don't want them to have this naming pattern, you can go up here to animation, and then to edit track, and then rename in timeline order. It'll then rename everything in the layer from 1 to 9. And those are basically all the unique images, all the unique layers. It will rename all the layers in a sequence if you want things to be organized in that way. Remember, if you delete a cell, it doesn't delete the layer. The layer still exists. And in fact, we can see it's linked to other cells within that animation folder row. Think of it as having stacked images for your animation, and then you remove one of the images from the stack. Just because you remove one of the images from the stack doesn't mean that image is gone. The image is only truly gone if we delete it here in the animation folder on the layer window. So if we do that, then you can see there is a hole where every cell 4 now is an empty cell, not linked to anything. So Control Z, we have everything back as we want. It doesn't matter how the layers are ordered in the layer window within the animation folder. What matters is the order of the cells on the timeline. So even if it's numbered, the way it's numbered on that layer, I can move things around. It doesn't matter, right? What really matters is how the cells linking to those layers are ordered on the timeline. And as you can see, you have 1, 2, 3 coming after. We've already seen 1 to 9. Like, it's all, I can move things around however I want, but the timeline order is what matters, not necessarily the layer order. The same way you can link to a layer, you can also link to a folder. So let's say at 8, in between 1 and 8, we want to create a folder. Even the folder maintains that naming sequence and has it 8A because it's in between. But you can't really do anything in 8A because it's not linked to anything in the animation folder row. Then we can specify cell either here. Another way to specify cell is here at the top, animation, edit track, and then specify cells. And then we can just go to that folder name called 8A. Now we can draw within 8A. However, there isn't any layer inside 8A. 8A, this is just a folder. So we want to create a new layer that will be inside 8A. And turn on the onion skin. And you can have multiple layers. So you have another layer, and let's say this layer has a different blending mode and opacity right above it. You can use a different brush, different color. Pull it underneath. And that's what's in the 8A folder. You can pull everything. Let's extend it so we can do more creative stuff. Remember, if we create a new cell now, it's going to copy everything in the same way 8A is. So if we create a new cell, it's going to copy those properties. And now 8B is also a folder because 8A was a folder, which is the cell before it. It also has 2 layers inside. And the layers inside also are mimicking the same opacities and blending modes. These things sometimes can make things easier for you during the whole process of creating your animation. The only thing it doesn't copy is the images themselves, but it's copying the opacity, the blending modes, how many layers are in the folder, the fact that it's even a folder. It's copying all that stuff. I don't need 8B, so I'm just going to ignore that. I'll pull all these guys back. Go to 8A. I was just playing around with the lighten and the glow, so I'm just going to turn that off. And for now, if you hit play, if you go to animation, edit track, and rename timeline order, is going to rename 8A to 9, and it renamed 9 to 10. You can also zoom in and out in the timeline. But remember, this is just regular folders and layers. But the reason why it works with the whole animation is because it's within an animation folder. If we just created, say, a regular layer or folder outside of any animation folders, it's going to create its own in the timeline window, except a regular folder just displays what's in the folder as is throughout the timeline. All the frames on the regular folder row will essentially display a still image throughout. You can't create cells, you can't link to anything. The same way the default paper layer or any regular layer outside of an animation folder can't be linked to any cells, or you can't do anything there. You can see here, the buttons don't work, right? The buttons don't work to create any cells, delete cells, specify cells. It doesn't work, right? But independent of any animation folders here, it's just on its own. If we do draw something on there, it's just going to be the same throughout. So sometimes this can be used to create, say, a background or something, right? So let's put this layer inside this folder, right? Doesn't matter, we can see both. You can turn it off here as well. Since we have a silhouette of a bird, let's kind of create a sunset. M marquee tool. If you want it to be a real nice circle, just hold shift. Now we have all of that in one animation folder, and that's really our background. Now we can see our bird is still, right? It's flying, but it's really in one place. We could have frame by frame drawn it going forward, but there are other ways to do that. Clip Studio Paint is compatible with other software, so the backgrounds and other assets can be created by other people using whatever they're using, or put together all during compositing, which can also be done in Clip Studio Paint. Compositing is just where all the flashy effects and camera movements and blah 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 can all be made and done to make the animation look more saucy. But like I said, let's try and move this bird without actually having to draw the bird moving. That way we can have the bird in a loop while still moving it around. Because if we drew it frame by frame going forward and smaller towards maybe the sun or whatever, we would literally have had to draw every frame of the scene. But because we have it in a nice little loopy type thing, we can then move the whole bird around while it's in its loop. And you do that with motion tweening. Tweening is a key process in all types of animation, including computer animation. It's the process of generating intermediate frames between two images called the keyframes, like we discussed earlier, to give the appearance that the first image evolves smoothly into the second one. So you go to that animation folder row. You have to first enable keyframes on the layer. For motion tweening, I like to go to this icon and make sure it's on Create Keyframe Linear Interpolation. Hit this plus button. It then gives you more options. Once you see the icon change, you can move that. Enabling the keyframes over here on this layer for this animation folder row kind of turned our whole animation in that row into an object. And then we can then move that object around however we see fit. And then here with this icon, you get to see more options, right? So here under position, if we change shortcut O to operation or use this icon over here, we can kind of move our bird around, and we can kind of have the bird a little bit off frame. We're going to pull it in later on, but you can see once we moved it around on this part of the timeline, we're at the beginning of the timeline, the first frame. It creates a key point / keyframe for the position of the bird. Then we can just go to the last frame in the timeline, and this time pull the bird to where we want it to end up. Notice that it created another keyframe right here, and then we want to maybe reduce the size of it as it's going towards the sun. Hold shift here, go to one of the points, and then pull that, and then it created another key point. Now if we then go across the timeline, you can see what it's doing. Play. We have our bird flying across the screen. I think now you can actually turn off the keyframes if you want. If you turn off the keyframes, then you lose that animation. Turn it back on, and then you have it. I'm gonna change the blending mode for the animation folder because you can do that. Maybe overlay. And now if we press play, see our bird. There are things you can do to your animation, like throwing in audio. Audio can help you with your timing of when you do certain parts of the animation, especially if you're working with an animatic. An animatic is basically, let's say, a scene or the whole freaking animation, but animated in very storyboardy ways. So a storyboard animatic, right? But it still has the sounds and everything you need to help you when putting together the actual animation. I'm gonna take it back to normal, so it'll be a black silhouette. Audio to your animation, come here, new animation layer, audio, or file, import audio, so you can give your animation music or something to work with. And then you see that layer over there. I'm going to pull it down. Once on there, you can see some tool properties you can play with, like the volume if it's too loud. And you can also work with the volume, kind of like keyframes, where you can have part of the volume low, and then maybe you move a little further down, and then if you increase the volume, it's going to create a keyframe. So basically, we had the volume at first at 45, and it's going to be increasing until it gets to that next keyframe once we have it at 76, and then it's 76 throughout. And if I hit play, you're going to hear the music. You can also import movies. So let's say you want to import your storyboard animatic and so on and so forth. Last thing I want to show before I get into the deeper, more complex stuff would be the 2D camera. So we come up here to the top, go to animation, go to 2D camera folder. We'll then create a camera folder right here. Select all the folders you want to mess with. Hit the first one at the top, then hold shift and select the last one that you want. And then click and drag them all to put them in the camera folder, right? So now everything is in that camera folder. I'm gonna close the camera folder. It can be closed or open, doesn't matter. But then I'm going to open it up. You can play around with the opacity, blah, 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 but we don't want to play around with that really. We only want that so we can see more options for position, scale, and ratio and all that. And then the camera is basically just showing us everything we're actually going to see. Now we have the bird flying across the screen, right? And the camera is just here. Once you have the shortcut O and you're on object, you can kind of see where the camera is seeing. So this is what we get to see of the camera. But we can pull it back and we can have the camera actually follow the bird. So say we reduce it right there. And then you can see all the keyframes are created for the position, scale ratio, rotation, all that, because we kind of moved it. We go to the end, figure out where the bird is, which is down there, and we just move it. We can also do it to where as we're moving the camera down, we're expanding the camera too. So this way the camera is not just panning. And then we can go back to the beginning. That's where the camera is, that's where the bird is. That's where the camera is, that's where the bird is, right? Go back to the beginning, hit play. And they can see the camera following. If we want to see exactly what the camera is, then you come to this side where it's display mode, and we go from show field guides where we get to see everything, or we go to show camera field of view. Now we're going to see exactly what the camera is doing. Make sure you're highlighting that camera. That's the only way it works. Then object, we can kind of pull that a little bit up, stay within the frame. Then go back to camera field of view, press play. And voila. Also, while in this mode and you have keyframes enabled, you can find certain spots in your animation folder that maybe you want to record the position of, say, our bird, and just hit keyframe icon here where we had it turned on linear interpolation, and it'll just kind of record that. And we can find another spot and record those two, right? And then maybe you want to do something different here in the middle. Now on our bird object, if we want to do something crazy, let's shift it far over there. When you move it, obviously it will automatically record. So it's gonna do something crazy, but I'm just trying to prove a point. Let's see that again. So you can do fun stuff like that. Also, obviously you can't edit the drawing. Let's say we go to our real G pen while it's an object, but if you hit edit layers with active keyframes, kind of makes things editable for a second once we highlight the cell we want and see. And then we hit the edit button again, go hit play, it's gonna be crazy. There you go. Undo all that jazz. Then you can do more compositing stuff to really sell it. But for now, this is all we need for our animation. Remember that this button only allows us move through the frames. And sometimes we kind of just want to go from keyframe to keyframe to kind of make sure everything is working properly. If we want to make some edits to them, we kind of want to be able to move quickly within the frames. Because the alternative would be to come up here to animation, edit track, and then have to come up here to get to the next cell. And that's just tedious. You kind of have to come up here to animation, then edit track, and then select previous cell. Or the same thing, but next cell, right? But instead, you can do it where you just have the shortcuts. I have shortcuts 7 for previous cell, 9 for next cell, and 8 for play stop, right? So without doing anything, I just hit my keyboard and I just go to the cells step by step, cell by cell, instead of frame by frame, which is faster, or just 8 for play and stop on my keyboard. So you want to create shortcuts for the things that you use often. The way to do that would be to come up here to Clip Studio Paint, shortcut settings, on the main menu, under animation, right? On the animation, you then look for, have play stop here. You click on it, you can edit it. I already have one there, or you add a shortcut a different shortcut if you want, but I don't want anything. You can edit it. I can change it to a different one. Maybe I want it to be 6, and then I hit OK. But don't want to do that, so I'm just gonna hit 8 back, and that'll be that, and I hit OK. Previous cell and next cell, or literally whatever action you want. You then highlight that action, edit shortcut, type the key you want to use for it, and then hit OK. Now I'm gonna turn my keyframes back on so that our bird is doing what it's supposed to be doing. I just want to show you guys that real quick so you guys understand a little bit better the importance of going cell by cell. We can still do it with the keyframes on, but I just wanted you guys to see it with the keyframes off first, right? So I'm hitting 7 going cell by cell, and 9 going cell by cell, and then 8 the shortcut to display and stop. But now we have our whole animation. If you kind of want to export, you go to File, Export Animation, and then you have your options here. You can export as a GIF, as a movie, or image sequence. Usually you might want to export as image sequence. If you want to do compositing elsewhere, you can export the animation cells, so basically just the cells themselves, or image sequence, which will essentially be frame by frame. We hit that, figure out where it's going to be exported to. You can change the timeline name if you want. If you want the files to be exported as a PNG or JPEG or whatever. Here you want to tick export the frames. On the drawing area, if you export the output frames, we're only exporting essentially what's within the output area. But if you wanted to export entire canvas, that would be exporting, the 200 pixels on each end as well, which I tend to want to do anyways. Because we use the camera, we want to apply the 2D effect camera, so we export what the camera is seeing as well, and then we have it on output frames. But if you the entire canvas, it can still follow the camera, but it'll be a little weird. So we're just gonna do output frame, right? So we're not taking the 200 on each end, and apply 2D camera effects. There's 74 frames. We want to export everything. Still 12 frames per second. That's the frame rate. And then you hit OK. Kind of want it to be exported into a folder. Let's call it bird or birdie, and then create. So it's going to go there, open, that's where it's going to go, and you hit OK. Now we go to birdie, and we see literally every frame in an image sequence. This is it. Just keep scrolling down. It's almost like a flip book, and if there was a flip book and we printed out the flip book and we flipping through the pages, this is how the animation would be up until the end. Export animation, you can export as a GIF, obvious, it will just be a GIF, GIF, whatever you want to call it. You can export as a movie, same deal. Turn the music back on. You hit OK, and then it gives you more options. Keep all the settings the same. Again, we want to apply the 2D camera effect as is. The frame rate is going to 30. You can have it be 30. It doesn't 100% need to be 12. If you change it back to 12, it'll just play as it's playing in Clip Studio Paint. But let's test out 30 and let's see what happens. I don't touch this, you can leave it at 128. And it works fine. So 12, hit OK. Let's play that. Practically works the same almost. And there you have it, guys. The basics of animation in Clip Studio Paint. Now it's time for part 2. So first we do some setup. I create a scenario, create a little story with narration and dialogue. And from that, I get an animation storyboard template and I plot out exactly what's gonna happen. What's gonna be happening with the cameras, how long we're gonna stay on each shot. Is it gonna pan, zoom, what's gonna be happening in the shot with the hair flaps and whatever. Because the primary thing here is gonna be, some hair flow animation. And then the character here, Sano, open his mouth before he closes his arms, and that'll be that, but then there'll be this narration happening in the background. Bottom line, we figure out the storyboard animatic, which is just like a storyboard for a comic, but in this case it's for an animation, and it'll have sound, and it'll basically be the animation but in very rough form. I import the movie into Clip Studio Paint, as well as the audio, and in this case I imported both and put them in a folder right under the animation folder that I've created, specifically to create the rough keyframes. So then create another animation folder for just the line work of those keyframes, and then on that same animation folder I'll do the in-betweens, creating the line work with the onion skin, and the main lines, not the rough keyframes, but the final line art as well as the in-betweens. Those will be vector lines in the vector layer. And for those, I advise to use the real G pen, the G pen, or the real pencil to a thin brush size. These are similar to what most anime use. Currently I'm using the real G pen, but if you're going to use the real pencil, highlight it, hit that wrench, and then under texture, make sure emphasize density is not ticked on for a darker and more authentic pencil look. Now remember, when you create a new animation folder, it doesn't come with any cells. So you then create a cell, and by default, it gives you a cell linked to a raster layer. You then delete the layer, not the cell, because if you delete the cell, the layer still exists. You delete the layer, so you delete the layer and the cell at the same time. You delete the layer, so it deletes the cell that it's linked to, so you lose both at the same time. And then you create a vector layer and put it in that animation folder. This way, remember, every cell we then create afterwards will then automatically create a layer linked to that cell, and then it'll copy the properties of the layer linked to the previous cell. Therefore, every cell you create automatically creates a layer that's a vector layer. Here we want all our line work to be vector. Remember, vector layers are easier to edit, especially if you're editing with the vector eraser. The vector eraser allows you to completely delete full strokes effortlessly. If a vector line crosses path with another vector line, you can literally erase the stroke before the split in very easy ways, and this just helps the process of putting together your line work for your character. We create line work based off of the rough keyframes and the rough keyframe animation folder underneath, and then we do our in-betweens, which will also be vector layers and vector lines using our onion skin. We don't need to do in-betweens for the rough. You create the rough, you play, if it does what you want and the timing is okay, you then create the vector line work based off of those roughs and then do the in-betweens, and then you hit play until it looks good. You can always move the cells around like we discussed. One of the assets you build as part of the prep for your animation is maybe a character design sheet that just tells you how your character looks, like we have here with the Road to Sano. Once you finish this video, you can see me put together this character design sheet in Clip Studio Paint in a previous video on the channel, so there's that. And what Clip Studio Paint allows you to do on the top right, you can turn on the sub-view window, which you can also find in the window at the top. Just turn on the sub-view window, and the sub-view window allows you to import images in there that you can use for reference. In this case, I'm just using it as reference for me to draw the character in the animation. This is best for consistency, especially if you're working in teams. You can zoom in and out of the subview, eyedrop the subview. You can't really edit the image there. It's just there for reference to tell you how to draw the character or what colors to use, as you can use the eyedropper. The key animator is basically the one that handles the keyframes. And then they pass on the keyframes to the assistants with notes highlighting where the cells are going to be, how many cells are going to be in between the keyframes, so how many in-betweens they're going to be and where they're going to be placed. Sometimes it's what is called a timesheet, which you can also export in Clip Studio Paint. Sometimes visually labeling each cell 1, 2, or 1A, 2A, whatever the case may be, so that no one on the team ends up working on the wrong cell by mistake. They have a stronger understanding of all the principles and guides of animation. They know what they're doing. I don't know about me. But I'm a one-man army here, so I'm kind of handling both the keyframes and the in-betweens here. It depends on how your team is set up. So you got your key or keyframe animators, and then assistants filled with second keyframe animators or in-betweeners, list goes on. For a character's body here, we're not going to have that many cells because he's pretty much standing still until towards the end of the animation where he opens his mouth a little bit and then he clenches his fist, so there'll be new cells to do that. On a separate layer where we'll have lines for the hair, that's where we're going to have a lot of cells and a lot of keyframes and in-betweens for a nice smooth hair flow motion. Because the hair is going to be doing a whole lot more stuff, it's going to have more cells and more in-betweens on that one versus the body. It's basically going to be constant for the most part until our character opens his mouth a little bit and then clenches his fists, and most of those cells will happen towards the end of the animation. So for the majority of the beginning of the animation is just one cell occupying a bunch of frames, showing essentially a still image of the character just standing in this pose. Here on the animation folder for the hair, that's separate, I'm putting the in-betweens, also vector lines. Here I'm just trying to do the best job I can with the hair motion. Hopefully it's smooth in the end, as you guys will see. I'll move cells around to make it work. I might delete some lines and replace the lines with other things, make sure everything looks as best as possible. And that comes with time, a lot of correction, moving cells around, and then hitting play in a loop to see how it works until we get it right. And doing that consistently is, the cleanup. So sometimes there is another art director above everything that oversees the whole animation to make sure that everything is smooth, and then orders cleanups here and there and editing here and there just to make sure everything looks good. Sometimes that art director is also a key animator. It depends on how your team is set up. And then here, how sometimes you see certain things happen in anime and it kind of feels like a loop, but there's this illusion because of all the fluff that's happening around it, and maybe the camera is panning in a certain way so it feels less like a loop, even if it is a loop, like when the hair is flowing in the wind. That's because it's a loop. So we're going to copy the cells and then restructure it in order to create our loop, like we did in the first example in the basic part of this tutorial, to make sure our starting point does some cool animation and then transitions back to our starting point. So cell 1 does its thing, and then you start creating cells to transition into cell 1. So you just have to rearrange the cells to get that loop. And eventually in the animation, the hair will kind of relax, where almost like the wind stops blowing a little bit. And so then I have to create newer cells that are now breaking from the loop and making the hair kind of fall normally. Now I'm on the animation folder for the body, creating cells towards the end for the closing of the fist and the mouth opening a little bit. I also had to add some rough cells in the Rough Keyframe animation folder as a start, so I know what I'm doing before I go back into the animation folder for the body where I'm creating the vector lines. And the same old, you create the keyframes first and then you create the in-betweens after. Always create the keyframes first and then the in-betweens, figuring out how many in-betweens you actually need for a smooth transition. Note that sometimes you might have to duplicate a layer in the animation folder, but note when you duplicate a layer in the animation folder, it doesn't create a cell. You then have to create a cell through specify cells to link it to this new duplicate that you've created. In some cases, you'd want to do that because you don't want to draw the same thing again, especially if you want the drawing to be exact. Like in the case of this character standing still in this pose. The only thing we want to edit is the arm, so we duplicate the layer and create a cell linking it to this new duplicate, and then just editing that duplicate just in the hands, rather than drawing the whole thing from scratch with the onion skin, because you're not going to get it perfect again. So in order for the animation to feel smooth and the character to look exactly the same how you want it, if you know you're just going to make minor edits to it, you want to duplicate that layer and then create a cell to link to it and then edit it versus drawing it from scratch. Now we're filling in color. You want to make sure you're using the fill tool. You keep hitting shortcut G and it will toggle a couple other tools before you get to the fill tool. And when you're on fill tool, you want to make sure you're on refer other layers, because now we're going to create another animation folder just for the color. And inside this animation folder, each cell is going to be linked to a folder holding layers, and each layer is going to be all the colors that will be on the character. So one layer might just be the color for the character's skin, another layer might be the color for the character's pants, or you might even structure it rather than terms like that, but you can structure it into layers where one layer is going to contain all the hues of yellow or all the hues of red, and you can structure it however you want. But essentially we're just filling in the flats. And putting it in a folder and making our cells link to the folder. You want to make sure on the fill tool settings, you have fill in vector path ticked on, as well as include vector path. This way, when you fill in colors, it's going to get in all the spaces. It's going to cover even the space that the vector line covers. That way you don't have any tiny holes that the colors don't get to. You need to have a good understanding of how the fill tool works, especially with closed gaps. This way, if there are certain gaps within your line work, you can play around with the closed gap. Depending on the bar you pick, Clip Studio Paint would be forgiving of those tiny holes, and rather than fill past it, will still stay within the space. Again, these videos are part of a playlist, and in this playlist, there is a video that goes into detail about drawing smooth lines, especially with vector lines, so I recommend you guys go back and watch those if you're interested. And maybe in the future we'll do another video that focuses more on the fill tool, but if you just follow these settings, you should be good. There's another video in this playlist that focuses on color and filling in color, but in that video you used the magic wand and expanded our selection before we filled in color in order to get these spaces. In that video we were using raster lines, but vector lines make it easier. So if you use a fill tool, as long as you have fill up the vector path and include vector path, and the lines are vector lines on a vector layer, then you should be good, because they will fill in the spaces and then fill to the path created by the vector lines. This makes it easier to fill up the gaps and the spaces created by your lines. So on our new animation folder for color, we literally just do that and fill in all the colors for the body. You then want to have a new animation folder for color for the hair separate, and do the same thing. You want to create a new animation folder for things you know would be animated differently or you feel would make your animation easier. So here I also have an animation folder for the designs on his body and how they move, and make sure they correspond to the movement of the character appropriately. So these white glowing lines are literally just white lines with a blue stroke that we hit with a border effect. Again, the video on coloring kind of touches this, but anytime you're adding color in Clip Studio Paint, it can't be a vector layer. You can't fill in any spaces on a vector layer. The vector layer primarily is for creating the line work. So this whole time we've been filling in colors, those have been raster layers. So the same applies to the cell shading and lighting here, where we're working in cels. We're going to be shading in cels. That's where the term comes from, right? Cell shading mimics 2D animation style coloring anyways. That's why it's called cell shading. I'll turn off the animation folder holding the flats of the character so I can see the lines better. And how this works is you have an animation folder. In this case, we'll have one for the body and one for the hair. And we'll have animation folders for shading, one for the body and then one for the hair. And they'll be linked to folders. Those folders will have one vector layer in it and one raster layer in it. You want to make sure you give the raster layer a linear burn blending mode, or a blending mode you know works best for your shading. Again, I touched on this a little bit in my coloring video with Clip Studio Paint. And then you want to make sure you give it the right opacity. And then the vector layer is just a vector layer, and it's all in one folder, and the cell is going to be linked to that folder. That way, if you create cels afterwards, they would just copy the properties of the folder linked to the previous cell, making the whole workflow easier. And then what you do is animate the vector lines first. You want to use the vector lines to make sure the animation is smooth and correct for the actual shading, because it's much easier to animate with the vector lines than just to animate straight shading with the raster layer, because it will just be blobs. It'll be hard to use the onion skin to do that. So you do it with the vector layer. In this case, doing the cell shading for the body, each cell linked to the folder, that vector layer inside that folder is not going to be doing much since the body's not moving much. But towards the end of the animation where he clenches his fist and opens his mouth and stuff like that, the animation changes just a little bit. And so most of the animation is going to take place there using the vector lines. And once we've done the animation for the vector lines and we have it as smooth as we can, then we go to our raster layer within those folders, and then we fill in with the same color so it's consistent throughout. Maybe a cool color or a warm color, depending on the environment of the character. I'm going to turn back on the flats so I can see how it works and make sure that the blending modes are right and they're consistent, make any tweaks that need to happen, and then you're done. It'll be much harder to do this for the hair animation because there's a lot more moving pieces. So on the cell shading animation folder for the hair, we'll do the same thing, except the vector layers within those folders linked to the cels will be doing a whole lot more work. Sometimes cell shading is not done this way. In some cases, you might just link the cell to a layer in an animation folder. But rather than messing with all the blending modes and the opacities and things like that, it will just be a flat color. And you'll be using the eyedropper tool to pick the colors you need from the character sheet that will have the swats for the flats of the character, as well as the parts that are going to be shaded in. If the mood based off of the environment needs to be tweaked later on, that can be done in compositing. And we'll talk about compositing towards the end of the video. And so essentially, it's all flats. Even the shading is just all flats. It's a little more complicated, but maybe less complicated for some. But just stay tuned to the channel and we will explore it in time. The same way we do it to get the shading is the same way we do it to get any lighting or flash lighting or sparks that are going to be hitting the character. It's kind of the same approach. You're playing with the vector lines to find those spaces and animate the lines for those spaces, and then filling them in with the raster layer. You know, the vector and the raster will be in that folder that's linked to the cells, and then you apply the same approach. Same way you shade, the same way you add any lighting, the same way we put in the mood, again based off of the environment of the character, how the character is going to be colored and all of that. Again, it's covered in the video where I'm coloring the character. Before we even fill in the colors, you actually also want to get your vector eraser. And here, since we have the lines for the hair on a separate animation folder for the lines on the body, there are parts of the hair that kind of overlap with parts of the body. So then there are some lines that I want to get rid of. Once I get rid of them, we're still going to see some lines overlap from the lines from the body, right? Because everything's kind of see-through at this point. But we don't want to delete the lines for the body because that's consistent. But the hair part, we can get rid of some of those lines using the vector eraser. And then we just make sure that when we're filling in the color on a separate layer, because remember the flats will be on a separate animation folder for the hair, you just want to make sure that that animation folder is above the line work for the body. That way we don't see the line work for the body in places that we shouldn't. Now I'm doing the same thing to the hair and just tidying up the cells where I feel like maybe while filling in, it kind of maybe doesn't look right in certain places. Some parts need to be manually filled in with maybe a pen or a pencil or whatever. And then I'm erasing parts that maybe are expanding past the line work. This is overall just cleaning up and tidying up the cells in the animation. Adding some more flashy sauce with some of the lighting hitting the character. Same approach. You're linked to folders. In those folders, you have a vector layer to get the path, and then a raster layer to fill in those spots with the blending mode and opacity touch up and all that. And I just have like quick flashes on the character. I'm arranging those flashes and cells on the timeline, how I see fit. Remember, how we're arranging some of these things are also tied to the storyboard animatic that's still playing at the bottom. You guys can't hear it, but I can. And it also tells me where to place certain things. So there are some sounds for like flashes, so I know where to place them. And I know how to randomize some of the cells because it's just a flash, right? It doesn't need to be a smooth transition. Like, it flashes on one end and that's that. And then the flashes on the other side and that's that. So that comes with time and practice, and you kind of understand what I'm talking about as you see the cells and then eventually the final animation. Sometimes if you don't have an animatic, you can actually leave notes for where things should happen. And that's just hitting that plus button under track label. You kind of right click and then you can leave a note for maybe somebody else on your team and hit enter or click away. The way to delete it will be to click on it, delete the words, and then click away or delete the words and hit enter. Now here I'm just doing some compositing / editing using the 2D camera where I see fit, and then using the motion tweening where I see fit to get what we need, to get a desired result. You can change the view, you can change the field view of the camera to see things a little better, and we're doing what we want. Then I get some of the background assets that we created. Again, sometimes this is done by a separate team. Some people paint this stuff traditionally, scan in, and then they use that. But here we did it digitally. We have a dawn-looking vanilla sky type thing, and then I'm going to add that to the animation. Remember, this can be done on a regular folder outside an animation folder, or you can use an animation folder. It's up to you. However you want to use it to work, whether you want to eventually tween it, blah, 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 whatever you want to do. Or we're going to place it in the frame and then just keep editing until we get the desired result. And as you can see, everything is slowly starting to come together. Here I drew my halo. The halo is not doing everything with the camera because the folder that the halo is drawn in is outside the 2D camera folder. So once I place that in, it'll play ball. I'll have a following video on the channel that will focus on all the editing that took place. So before I show you guys the final after all the editing, shout outs to the 2.5 people that made it to the end of this video. Please like the video, a lot of work went into it. Leave comments of any questions you may have, as well as your own approaches to making animation. Holy Ghost, smash that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. Hit that bell so you stay notified each time I upload absolutely anything. Use the links for the free 3-month trial of Clip Studio Paint. You can pre-order Super Saturday, where Saturday Wars is going to be published alongside a lot of original content. Interview with Steve Aoki, RDC World, Karen Berger, Eisner Award winner, the list goes on. Read the Saturday AM comics. Check out our app. It's free to download. Saturday AM has the shonen content. Saturday PM has the seinen content. And then Saturday brunch is the josei content. There's a free starter guide within the magazine that goes into more detail about who we are if you're new. And the latest issue of all the magazines we publish are free on the app. The magazines feature our comics, interviews from people in the industry, the list goes on. Thanks for watching, guys. Without further ado, here's the animation.
Our Savior, the Trinity, will be born amidst the blessings of the god of sorcery, with the lock and key of dreams to a brighter existence, forged from a loving heart. The Trinity will dawn the infinite night, a great darkness set to plague the world till it descends into oblivion. The night is nigh.